Hello and welcome. I'm Anand Naidu filling in for Riz Khan. After 6 years of what many analysts believe has been a hands-off approach by US President George Bush, the Israeli-Palestinian peace process appears to be at a standstill. New clashes and Israeli airstrikes have left 20 people dead in Gaza in the past day. 3 Israeli servicemen have also died in the violence. As far as peace is concerned, the Palestinians remain hopelessly divided. Hamas controls Gaza and Fatah is in charge of the West Bank. All this a long way from Camp David, the talks of 2000, where reportedly a deal was almost reached. So how did the peace process get to this point, and is there any hope of getting it back on track? Don't forget, we take your calls on the show, and the question we're asking today is, what do you think will get the Palestinians and Israelis back to the peace table? You can reach us there at the numbers at the bottom of your screen. Joining me today are Aaron David Miller, a former US diplomat who spent 2 decades working on Middle East policy. He's just published The Much Too Promised Land, America's Elusive Search for Arab-Israeli Peace. And Mort Zuckerman, Editor-in-Chief of US News and World Report and owner and publisher of the New York Daily News. He's also the former chair of the Conference of Presidents of major Jewish organizations here in the United States. He joins us from New York. Gentlemen, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure.
Let me start with you. Former US President Jimmy Carter is currently in the Middle East. He's in Egypt holding talks with Hamas. The United States and Israel have been very sharply critical of this initiative by Jimmy Carter. Do you see these talks serving any purpose at all?
I don't, in large part because America doesn't have the incentives, the credibility, or the leverage to begin a dialogue with Hamas. And frankly, as the religious manifestation of Palestinian nationalism, it took us 20 years to get the PLO involved in negotiations, and those came not as a consequence of a U.S. initiative, but as a consequence of Israel's decision to confront and talk to Arafat. If in fact there is a dialogue, and I doubt if there will be one, between the Israelis and Hamas, it's going to come as a consequence of backroom channels between Israel and Hamas, not as a consequence of an American-mediated initiative. And I think President Carter, frankly, who deserves a lot of credit for the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty, really has wandered off the highway since he's left the White House in a lot of his views and initiatives on this issue.
There are some who say that he might be giving legitimacy to Hamas. Do you think that will happen?
I don't think that's the issue. My problem is we're failing. We failed in 8 years of Bill Clinton for Arab-Israeli peacemaking, and we failed for 8 years under George W. Bush in our capacity to make war and protect our interests. So the question, frankly, is not legitimacy or illegitimacy. The question is, how does America fashion for itself a policy with respect to peace and war that actually works and is effective? That's the challenge probably for the next president.
Mort, I want to ask you the same question. Now, I know you've been very critical of these talks. You wrote a scathing piece in US News and World Report about these talks, about Hamas. But I want to read to you just an excerpt from an editorial that was in the Israeli newspaper Haaretz, which is supportive of the Carter talks. And it says, in part, Carter's method, which says that it is necessary to talk with everyone, has not proven to be any less successful than the method that calls for boycotts and airstrikes. In terms of results, at the end of the day, Carter beats out any of those who ostracize him, and the results that the editorial is referring to there is the efforts he made to broker the Israeli-Egyptian peace accord. Does Haaretz have a point?
Look, I think there is a small point. Let me just say, in respect of what you earlier stated, there are peace talks going on. Abu Mazen is meeting with Ehud Olmert, the Israeli prime minister, so you have the 2 leaders. Tzipi Livni is meeting with Abu Allah. The real question is, I think, as Aaron was implying, is there going to be enough common ground there to reach an agreement? There are many who believe that Hamas is not interested in a peace agreement at all, and that they will use whatever they can in the way of starting violence on Gaza to make it impossible for Abu Mazen to carry on a dialogue, and that very well may be the case. But in the meantime, there are peace talks going on, and frankly, I hope they can reach a preliminary agreement, because if they can't do it now, and it has to be done, in my judgment, by the parties themselves, I think it's going to become increasingly difficult to do so in the years ahead as Hamas really threatens the Fatah people in the West Bank, and it's hard for me to see how that's going to change without a peace agreement.
So how do you see this? How do you see the logjam being broken then?
Well, I think this is going to depend on the negotiations that are carried on right now between the Israelis and Fatah, between a prime minister who clearly is determined to try and reach an agreement, namely Ehud Olmert, and Abu Mazen, who also, I think, needs very badly to reach an agreement so that he can deliver more to the Palestinian people than he has been capable of delivering so far. There is a huge amount of donor money that has been pledged. These are just pledges, not actual delivery of funds. But I think if there is a basic agreement, there will be many countries in the world who will be determined to make sure that Abu Mazen succeeds as the leader, at least in the West Bank. And I think that is critical to his future. He may not see it that way, but I believe it would be the case. And therefore, I think everybody has to nourish those talks in every way that they can, recognizing that it's going to be those two political leaders who are ultimately going to have to make whatever deal is done. The United States is sort of playing a role. Jimmy Carter has no credibility with the Israelis at this point. Anything he does, frankly, is going to be counterproductive. Even Shimon Peres has been very strongly critical of it, the damage he has done to the peace process, and I understand that. So I do think, though, that George Bush does have credibility, and I think if he is willing to devote some constructive time to this process, perhaps not through his Secretary of State, but through direct dialogue, I do think there will be a chance for progress. He's going to be in Israel for the 60th anniversary, as you know, in May. In fact, I will be there in a part of the American delegation, so I'm looking forward to that. But I think he can play a constructive role. But basically, he's got a prime minister there who's determined to try and make this work, and he's really committed to it, to the chagrin of a lot of people on the right wing of Israeli politics.
Okay, Mort, let me go to Aaron. You've looked at the efforts that have been made by several administrations in the past. In your view, what is the Bush administration's track record on trying to seek peace in the Middle East?
Well, governing is about choosing. That's what it means to govern in Washington. You set your priorities. The administration came in having inherited a very bad hand. Arafat Sharon in a full-scale war between the Israelis and Palestinians. And for a variety of reasons, particularly in the wake of 9/11, they chose a set of other priorities. To their credit, they're trying to circle back in what remains the last year of the administration. And I think, in a sense, they can nurture this. But this is not an American story right now.
Isn't that too late, the last year of the administration, to try and get some kind of movement on this peace
Well, it's
process?
never too late. My concern is that we've moved on with respect to the situation in the region to the point where a conflict-ending agreement between Israelis and Palestinians, let me be very precise here, a conflict-ending agreement which resolves the four core issues, Jerusalem, borders, refugees, and security, is simply not going to happen anytime soon. And I think one of the illusions about my own experience in the negotiations, and I was as big a cheerleader for unworkable policies as anyone, this book is not an I told you so, is the fact that America has to find the right balance between doing too much on one hand. I would argue Bill Clinton, particularly in the last year and a half of his administration, egged on by myself as well as some of his advisors, and George W. Bush, who has done not enough. But Mort's point is worth considering. You cannot make bricks, to use probably an inappropriate biblical metaphor, without straw. Every breakthrough that has come, Egypt-Israel, Israel-Jordan, Israel-Palestinians, even though that unlike the other two, it was not sustainable, has come as a consequence of the parties themselves, for a variety of reasons, being willing to take, in the case of Sadat and Rabin, existential risks. You need a brick maker, however, and that, in essence, is America's role. We are the brick maker once the straw is there, the will is there, and the circumstances there to try to make progress. I just don't think right now, with the clock ticking down on his presidency, that George W. Bush, who confronts a galactically complicated situation. I mean, the Palestinian Humpty Dumpty has fallen off the wall, and it's cracked into at least two parts. And without a measure of Palestinian unity, Abbas could no more deliver the Palestinians to a conflict-ending agreement than Ehud Olmert would ever make existential concessions to a man, Mahmoud Abbas, well-intentioned, genuinely a man of peace, who doesn't control all of the guns. And that is the basic conundrum in which the Bush administration finds itself.
Well, I want to come back to the American role in just a moment, but we have a caller on the line. This is Mohammed calling from Dubai. Mohammed, go ahead with your question.
Hi. I was listening right now to Mort Zimmerman, who was just saying that there are people out there, mainly on Fatah's side, that are willing to speak with Israel. I just think we need to define, who do these people really represent? I mean, the Second Intifada was mainly not just obviously against Israeli occupation, but also against Palestinian corruption, mainly within Yasser Arafat and now Abu Mazen's presidency. And so we need to define exactly what Israel's peace willingness is. I mean, ultimately, we don't want a situation where there's a peace treaty signed that is favoring a certain elite group within the Palestinian side.
Okay, thank you for your call, Mohammed. Let's put that to Mort Zuckerman.
Yes, I think you raise an important point, which is that the leadership of Fatah is by and large discredited. We should not forget that Hamas actually got more votes in the West Bank and controls 6 of the major cities in the most recent election. And I think it was, as you suggest, a reaction to the corruption that is endemic in the leadership of Fatah. And I don't have any solution to that. But for these purposes, it seems to me, it does provide at least an incentive on the part of Fatah, which recognizes how weak it is politically, that in a sense, these talks, even though they may not be able to implement the agreement itself will give a great deal of benefit to Fatah, particularly in the form of the support of many nations in the world, including, I believe, a lot of Arab nations, if in fact a preliminary agreement is reached, and it has the political advantage to both sides that this agreement does not have to be implemented at this stage, but will be implemented only in effect when they can. The Israelis, I think, and particularly Ehud Olmert, has a similar political interest in that this is the one and most important incentive that he has for his own political future. So you have, in a sense, at least a shared political interest by Abu Mazen and by Ehud Olmert, which may or may not result in an agreement, but at least offers a chance to do so. So I encourage these talks, frankly, and I do believe there is a chance that they will reach some kind of an agreement this year because of the fact that it is in their mutual political interest, and both will benefit from it, and both Israel and the Palestinians will benefit it. It may not be able to be a finalized agreement, as Aaron says, because the Palestinian community is really cracked in half with the Hamas people. And if you saw the Foreign Minister al-Zahar's letter or column in the Washington Post today, it's as absolutist and as impossible a position that they are taking that would make any agreement impossible, and therefore it is possible that Hamas has no interest in an agreement, but Fatah does have an interest in an agreement, and therefore this may become possible, and I think would be the basis on which a lot of other countries could coalesce and put pressure on those communities to implement that agreement at some future time. So I think this is, in fact, a time of opportunity, limited though it may be. And as Aaron says, and as I believe, it is going to be up to the parties to do it. The influence of the outsiders, including the United States, is much less than most people realize, particularly, frankly, because the Secretary of State also has limited credibility in that part of the world, particularly with the Israelis.
Okay, let's go back to what you were talking about just now, the role of the United States. I'm going to look at an email here that we received from Paris in France. Bruno Druski in Paris writes to us, and he says, Israel survives only because of U.S. aid. Don't you think that if the U.S. really wanted peace, they have just to tell the Israelis to recognize UN resolutions or their aid will be cut? Or is this impossible because of the Israel lobby? And there is a chapter in your book, actually, when you talk about Israel's lawyer, when you say that the United States actually acts as a lawyer just for one side, not for both sides.
This is a much misunderstood topic, and I want to make a few points, hopefully, to clarify. Number one, we have a special relationship with the State of Israel, which exists independently, frankly, of any action or inaction with respect to the Arab-Israeli peace process. The broadest conception of the national interest is to support like-minded societies who share our values. And frankly, that is the broadest conception of our national interest. The Israelis maintain a different but a very resilient democracy and are among a handful of countries that have emerged during after the Second World War who you could say are democratic. Now, you could argue Israel's occupation of the West Bank clearly presents anomalies, as does Israel's treatment of almost 1 million Israeli Arabs who are not afforded social and economic rights. But by and large, most Americans perceive Israel to be a friend and a country worth supporting. We get ourselves into trouble when the special relationship, which we need, and in my judgment is the key to our leverage and influence in this process. If we had no relationship with Israel, I guarantee you our phone would not have been ringing over the course of the last 40 years. We get ourselves into trouble when our special relationship with the Israelis becomes an exclusive relationship. And that, I think, is not good for Israel, and it's certainly not good for American interests. And I would submit to you that...
Yeah, but what is that relationship based on? Is it shared values or is it strategic?
Well, I would argue, if you ask me, the strategic dimension is clearly important. The fact that you've got 5.3 million American Jews and scores of millions of evangelical Christians, as well as Americans generally, who think positively of Israel, all of that is extremely important. But what really drives this relationship is the bedrock of what I call value affinity. If you took out the value affinity, then the special relationship that we had with the State of Israel would not, in a democracy, in this democracy, be sustainable. People would not support it as they've supported it over the course of the last 60 years. Domestic politics is a much misunderstood issue, and I think, frankly, we're having a dishonest conversation. Too many in the Jewish community want to exclude domestic politics and argue there are no domestic politics, and too many on the other side want to attribute our support to Israel to a minority of American Jews who they wrongly believe have some sort of stranglehold over the course of American foreign policy. And that is simply wrong. The two professors, Walt and Mearsheimer, with whom I've exchanged words in NPR and other forum, argue that point. And I think it's a misreading of history, and frankly, it's a misreading of American interests.
Those questions have...
Special, yes. Exclusive, no, in terms of the relationship.
But there have been many questions that have come up on whether America acts in its own national interest or whether it acts in Israel's interest. I mean, you have those questions.
Yeah, and I would argue that America should be acting, at a minimum, in the interests of both the United States and Israel.
Okay, I want to get a quick call in. This is from Faruqi and Amman. Go ahead with your call.
My question is very small and simple. I understand that we all come from the same tree. We are all cousins, Christian, Jews, Muslims. My question is very simple. Why doesn't Israel limit itself to its own boundary and allow the Palestinian people to rule their...
Okay, we heard your question. Let me put that to Mort Zuckerman very quickly. And we just have 20 seconds, Mort.
Well, I'm afraid I didn't hear the question clearly, but if you were asking, would you repeat the question for me?
I'm sorry, we're going to have to leave it there. We've run out of time. Thanks for being with us. Riz is back on Monday with singer and songwriter Chris de Burgh. See you next time. Street Talk is next.